What would you do if your HOA accused you of illegal rentals, threatened massive fines, and even foreclosure, only to realize they had no power over your tenants at all? Homeowners associations are meant to keep communities organized. But what happens when they cross the line? When rules become power plays and enforcement turns into harassment? That's exactly what happened when my HOA blindsided me with accusations of illegal rentals, threatening massive fines and even legal action. They were certain they had me cornered, confident in their authority. But there was just one problem. They had no idea who my tenants really were. What started as a routine HOA crackdown spiraled into a legal battle they never saw coming. This wasn't just about some petty fines. It was about power, control, and a shocking oversight that completely dismantled their case. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. Stick with me as I break down every twist, every power move, and how I turned the tables on an HOA that thought they could bully me into submission. Living in an HOA community comes with its fair share of rules, some reasonable, others ridiculous. But for the most part, I played along. I kept my lawn trimmed, followed the parking guidelines, and paid my dues on time. No complaints, no conflicts. That is, until I received a notice that changed everything. The HOA claimed I was violating community policies by running an illegal rental, fines piling up, warnings escalating, and the threat of legal action looming over my head. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I wasn't renting out my home on some short-term rental app. My tenants had signed a long-term lease and everything was above board. But the HOA was relentless. They sent letters, emails, even had their so-called compliance officer show up unannounced to inspect my property. It was clear. They weren't interested in facts. They just wanted control. The HOA president, a man named Richard, had a reputation for being overzealous. He was the kind of guy who relished enforcing the tiniest infractions, from mailbox colors to the height of garden fences. And now he had set his sights on me. According to him, the community had a strict no short-term rental policy, and my tenants, who had only recently moved in, were suspiciously transient. In his eyes, that was all the proof he needed. The fines started at a few $100s, then quickly jumped into the thousands. Warnings turned into threats of legal action, and before I knew it, they were talking about placing a lien on my home. But here's where it gets interesting. My tenants weren't just any ordinary renters. They were diplomats working for a foreign government, living in the U.S. under special agreements. And as I would soon find out, that small detail made all the difference. But the HOA didn't know that yet. They were operating under the assumption that they held all the power, that I had no choice but to comply or face financial ruin. They underestimated me. I decided to push back. I attended HOA meetings, demanding clarification on their accusations. Each time I was met with vague legal jargon and a smug assurance that the rules are the rule. They didn't think I had an escape route. They assumed I'd cave under pressure, like so many homeowners before me. But they had no idea that they had just stepped into a fight they couldn't win. The stage was set. The HOA thought they were closing in, tightening their grip, but they had no idea that every fine, every threat, every aggressive move they made was only making my case stronger. What they saw as an airtight case was about to crumble, and it all hinged on one crucial detail they had completely overlooked. What happened next? Let's just say when the truth finally came out, the entire community was left in shock. If I thought the HOA was being aggressive before, I had no idea what was coming next. The moment they realized I wasn't rolling over and accepting their bogus fines, they doubled down, hard. The warnings turned into official violation notices, each one more threatening than the last. The fees skyrocketed overnight, climbing into the thousands. I was now being accused of willful noncompliance and disrupting community standards. Their letters read like a lawsuit in progress, carefully worded to make it seem like I had no options. And if that wasn't enough, they even began harassing my tenants. One morning, I got a frantic call from them. Apparently, HOA board members had shown up at the house demanding to speak with the occupants. They knocked, waited, and then started taking pictures through the windows when no one answered. My tenants, understandably, were furious. Not only was this an invasion of privacy, but it was borderline intimidation. They had diplomatic protections, and the last thing the HOA wanted was to be caught meddling with foreign officials. But of course, they had no clue who they were dealing with. Then came the so-called emergency board meetings. Richard, the HOA president, made it clear that my case was now a top priority. It wasn't just about enforcing the rules anymore. It was personal. At one meeting, I stood up to defend myself, but before I could even finish a sentence, I was shut down. Richard leaned back, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face, and said, "Mr. My last name, you are not above the law. We will take action." I countered with logic. I showed my lease agreement, the rental terms, proof that my tenants had been properly vetted. But none of it mattered. They weren't interested in facts, only control. They had already decided I was guilty, and now they were just piling on pressure, hoping I'd cave. The threats escalated further. One night I received a hand-delivered letter. No envelope, no formality, just a single-page notice taped to my door. It read, in bold capital letters, "Final notice. Failure to comply will result in legal action and a property lien." That was their endgame. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to panic. But instead I did something they never expected. I started fighting back. I contacted legal experts, researched HOA regulations, and most importantly, I reached out to my tenant's diplomatic office. I wanted to play this the right way, but if the HOA insisted on pushing this fight into legal territory, then they had no idea the storm they were about to walk into. And then the moment of truth arrived when the HOA finally realized who my tenants were. And let me tell you, their reaction? Absolute panic. Because the moment they understood the legal immunity my tenants had, they knew they had just stepped into a disaster of their own making. At this point, the HOA thought they had me cornered. They had issued their final warnings, stacked up their so-called violations, and were probably toasting to their inevitable victory. But they had made a fatal mistake. They underestimated how far I was willing to go. I spent nights poring over HOA bylaws, legal cases, and state regulations. I wasn't just looking for a loophole. I was looking for a pattern, a history of overreach, anything that would expose the HOA's corruption for what it really was. And then, buried deep in old meeting records, I found it. A list of previous violations issued by the board over the years. Dozens of homeowners had been fined for arbitrary reasons, some of whom had even lost their homes due to liens placed against them. But here's where it got interesting. Certain homeowners, ones who were well-connected or friendly with the board, had their fines forgiven or mysteriously waived. The rules, it seemed, only applied to people the board didn't like. That was my first breakthrough. But the real bombshell? I found an official complaint from 3 years ago filed against the HOA by a former homeowner. The claim? Illegal enforcement of rental restrictions. Sound familiar? It was almost identical to my case. And guess what? The HOA had settled quietly out of court, keeping it under wraps. They had done this before, and they had lost. Armed with this knowledge, I sent a formal letter to the HOA, citing their own history against them. I laid out in excruciating detail every instance of legal overreach I had found. I mentioned the previous lawsuit. I questioned the legality of their board elections, which, from what I could tell, had been conducted in direct violation of their own bylaws. I let them know, in no uncertain terms, that if they pursued legal action against me, I would not only countersue, I would drag their entire shady history into the light. Then came the kicker. I informed them that my tenants weren't just ordinary renters. They were diplomats, individuals protected under international law, and their legal team was already aware of the harassment they had been subjected to. But the moment the HOA had knocked on their door, taken photos, and issued threats, they had unknowingly crossed a line with serious legal implications. The silence from the HOA was deafening. No more aggressive letters, no more sudden emergency meetings. The smug confidence Richard once had seemed to evaporate overnight. And then, just like that, I received a new letter. But this time it wasn't a threat. It was a formal request for a private discussion with the board. That's when I knew the tide had turned. They weren't trying to find me anymore. Now they were trying to cut a deal. But at this point, it wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure they never pulled this on anyone else again. And I was just getting started. The HOA had backed itself into a corner, but they weren't ready to surrender just yet. Instead of admitting their wrongdoing, they doubled down, hiring an expensive legal team to intimidate me into submission. Their strategy was clear: bury me under a mountain of paperwork, hoping I'd either give up or run out of money fighting them. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't standing alone anymore. The moment word got out about my battle with the HOA, other homeowners started reaching out. I wasn't the first person they had targeted, and I certainly wasn't the only one tired of their abuse of power. People who had stayed silent out of fear finally found their voices. They provided documents, emails, and testimonies, evidence of years of selective enforcement, financial mismanagement, and outright corruption within the HOA. It wasn't just about my rental situation anymore. This was about exposing an organization that had been operating unchecked for far too long. With this overwhelming support, I took the fight to the next level. I filed a lawsuit. The case wasn't just about the fines and harassment I had endured. It was about the HOA's long history of illegal practices. And once the legal process started, things escalated fast. During the first hearing, my attorney presented our findings: the selectively enforced rules, the secret deals, the previous lawsuit they had quietly settled. The judge took immediate interest in the pattern of behavior. The HOA's lawyer tried to dismiss it all as unrelated, but the judge wasn't buying it. Then we dropped the bombshell: the diplomatic immunity of my tenants. The moment that revelation hit the courtroom, everything changed. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just dealing with an angry homeowner. They were facing potential federal implications for their harassment of protected individuals. The judge made it clear that if these allegations held up, the HOA could be in serious trouble, not just financially, but legally. And then, as if things couldn't get worse for them, the media caught wind of the case. Local news outlets ran with the story: HOA accused of illegal practices. Homeowner fights back. Reporters started digging into the HOA's past, uncovering even more questionable dealings. Some of the former board members, who had quietly left over the years, came forward with their own horror stories. The pressure was mounting, and the HOA was cracking under it. Realizing their legal team wouldn't be able to bury this in technicalities, the board made their final move. They offered a settlement. They wanted me to drop the lawsuit in exchange for waiving all fines, ceasing their harassment, and agreeing to reevaluate their enforcement policies. But at this point, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I had the support of an entire community, people who had been wronged for years. So I refused. This wasn't about settling. This was about making sure they never pulled this on anyone else again. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it was clear who was winning. The courtroom was packed on the day of the final verdict. Homeowners who had been watching this battle unfold showed up in full force, eager to witness what felt like a long overdue reckoning. The judge took his seat, glanced through the last of the evidence, and delivered his ruling, decisive, unflinching, and absolutely damning for the HOA. Not only were all fines against me dismissed, but the HOA was found guilty of multiple violations, including unlawful enforcement of policies, of financial mismanagement, and harassment of homeowners. The diplomatic immunity of my tenants was the final nail in their coffin. The board had overstepped their authority in a way that could have led to international legal consequences. The judge ordered them to pay restitution, overhaul their governance structure, and undergo a full financial audit. It was a sweeping decision, one that sent shockwaves through the community. But the real impact of the case wasn't just about my personal victory. It was about what came next. The ruling set a legal precedent, one that other homeowners in similar situations could point to. No longer could HOAs arbitrarily enforce rules or bully residents into compliance without accountability. This case exposed a fundamental truth: unchecked power in the hands of a few can easily spiral into corruption. In the weeks that followed, resignations poured in from board members who didn't want to stick around for the fallout. A new, more transparent leadership took over, promising open meetings, fair enforcement of policies, and, most importantly, an end to the culture of intimidation that had plagued the community for years. The homeowners, once fearful of speaking out, were now actively involved in making sure their rights were protected. As for me, I had won more than just a legal battle. I had earned the respect of my neighbors, many of whom admitted they had been too afraid to stand up against the HOA before. What started as a personal fight turned into a movement, proving that one voice, when backed by truth and persistence, can force even the most rigid systems to bend. But here's the most satisfying part. After everything, after all the threats, the finances, the legal battles, I didn't just get justice. I got something even better. Peace. The HOA was no longer a looming force dictating how I lived my life. My tenants continued their quiet existence, undisturbed as they were always meant to be. And I could finally enjoy my home without the constant fear of another ridiculous violation notice showing up in my mailbox. This fight wasn't just about me, it was about every homeowner who has ever been pushed around by an overzealous HOA, every person who has ever been told they don't have a choice. The truth is, you do. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to push back to change everything. At the heart of this story lies a simple but powerful truth. When faced with injustice, standing your ground can make all the difference. What started as an overreach by a power-hungry HOA quickly unraveled into a legal battle that not only exposed corruption, but also redefined the limits of their authority. The victory wasn't just about me keeping my tenants or avoiding unfair fines. It was about proving that no organization, no matter how entrenched, is above accountability. This case serves as a warning to every HOA that believes it can act unchecked and as a reminder to every homeowner that they are not powerless. Rules should exist to protect a community, not to be wielded as weapons by those in charge. When residents are informed, when they challenge unfair practices, when they demand transparency, change happens. But more importantly, this story is a testament to resilience. The HOA banked on intimidation, on bureaucracy, on the idea that I would simply fold under pressure. They underestimated how far I was willing to go for what was right. And in the end, that miscalculation cost them everything. So, if you ever find yourself backed into a corner by an organization that thrives on control, remember this. Knowledge is power, persistence is your weapon, and justice favors those who refuse to back down. Because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to fight back to spark a change that benefits an entire community. Stories like this prove that standing up for what's right can shake even the most rigid systems. But this isn't just my battle, it's something many homeowners face every day. Have you ever dealt with an overreaching HOA? Have you fought back against unfair policies? I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let's get the conversation started. And if you found this story as eye-opening as I did living it, make sure to hit that like button. It helps more people discover these kinds of stories. But don't stop there. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because I bring you real stories of challenge, resilience, and unexpected victories. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The more we share, the more we expose these injustices, and the more power we take back as homeowners, tenants, and community members. So let's keep this movement going. Like, comment, subscribe, and let's continue uncovering the stories that need to be told.